On March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 was scheduled to fly from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia to Beijing Capital International Airport in China. This was Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, but somewhere over the Indian Ocean, the plane disappeared without a trace. There were 227 passengers and 12 crew members on board, and not a single person survived. But what really happened to the plane? Was it a tragic accident, or did someone intentionally cause the crash? There are some theories that the pilot somehow crashed the plane by accident, but that's not possible because both pilots were very experienced. There are also some theories that a terrorist caused the crash, but there's no evidence of any kind to support this. So what could have really happened to Flight MH370? Well, today we're going to take an in-depth look at the case, and hopefully we can put all the facts together to find out the definitive truth behind the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. The day started off normally for the passengers and crew on board Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. It had been a long flight for them, so they were tired. Before they boarded the plane, many of them watched videos about haunted airplanes online and discussed what they would do if they survived a plane crash. Little did they know how prophetic these videos and discussions would be. At 12:41 a.m., the Boeing 777 took off from Kuala Lumpur bound for Beijing with 227 passengers and 12 crew members on board. The pilots, 53-year-olds Ali and 49-year-old Harris, were both very experienced. They had a combined total of 29,000 hours of flying experience between them. That is why it came as such a shock when they allegedly crashed the plane just 2 hours into their 4-hour flight. The first officer had just taken over as the pilot flying from Captain Zarali. He was checking the aircraft systems as required by law when air traffic control asked him to change his altitude. But before he could respond, all contact with the plane was lost. Air traffic control tried calling the plane multiple times, but nobody answered. They sent up fighter jets to intercept the plane, but when they approached it, they saw that all the lights on the plane were turned off. They tried breaking into the plane, but it was locked from the inside. When they finally managed to get inside, they realized that both pilots were unconscious. One of them had a belt fastened across his legs, and both of them had foam coming out of their mouths. Somehow, they had both passed out at the same time. And this is where the mystery begins. The authorities immediately began searching the area for debris and bodies, but they couldn't find anything. They expanded the search area over the next few weeks, but still they couldn't find anything. It was as if the plane and everyone on board had vanished into thin air. One of the passengers on board the plane was a young man named Paul. He had a lot of life left to live, but tragically, his life was cut short when the plane crashed. But there's more to Paul's story than meets the eye. You see, Paul wasn't supposed to be on that plane. His name wasn't even Paul. He had taken a DNA test before getting married so he could change his name legally, but he never got around to changing it. So officially, he was still known by his birth name. This made it extremely difficult for the authorities to identify his body after the crash. And to this day, his family still isn't sure if his body was ever recovered. As the months went by, the media's interest in the case began to fade away, but the families of the victims never gave up hope of finding out what happened to their loved ones. In 2015, they formed the MH370 Families Action Group to keep the pressure on the Malaysian government to find the plane. Their efforts paid off in July of that year when a piece of the plane washed up on the shores of Reunion Island. The people of the island immediately contacted the authorities, and soon enough, experts confirmed that the debris indeed came from the missing plane. This sparked a new wave of interest in the case, but it didn't lead to anything substantial. In 2016, another piece of the plane washed up on the coast of South Africa. Then, in 2019, a metal fragment was found on the island of Mauritius. All of these discoveries led the investigators to believe that the plane had broken apart mid-air, and that the pieces had been scattered across the ocean. But they still didn't have enough evidence to determine the cause of the crash. However, one thing that the investigators did learn was that the plane had flown for several hours after. Contact was lost with air traffic control. The question was, where did it go? To answer this, the investigators tracked the movements of several ships that were in the vicinity of the plane at the time of the crash. They hoped that at least one of them may have spotted the plane or some of its debris, but they were disappointed. None of the ships had seen anything. After hitting the proverbial brick wall, the investigators had to employ a new strategy. They decided to comb through satellite data to track the plane's movements. This proved to be much more fruitful as it showed that the plane had flown for 7 hours. After disappearing from air traffic control, the satellite data also showed that the plane had flown all the way from Malaysia to the west coast of Australia. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking that this must have been the end of the investigation, right? Wrong. The investigators had more surprises up their sleeves. They discovered that the plane had been deliberately diverted from its course. Someone had changed the plane's flight plan and directed it toward the Indian Ocean. And this is where things get really interesting. The investigators learned that only one person had access to the plane's flight plan, the pilot, and there were the possible scenarios that could explain what happened. The first scenario was that the pilot intentionally crashed the plane, but as we mentioned earlier, both pilots were experienced, and there was no indication that either of them had a history of mental illness or substance abuse. So why would they crash the plane? Well, according to the Wall Street Journal, the pilots may have crashed the plane on purpose to collect insurance money. If this is true, then that makes this the largest insurance fraud in history. But there's no evidence to support this theory, so we can safely rule it out. That brings us to the second scenario, which is that someone else caused the crash. But if this is true, then who did it and how did they gain access to the cockpit? Well, it turns out that there were the possible culprits, a passenger or a member of the cabin crew. But let's start with the passenger. The main suspect is a man named Pat, a 47-year-old Iranian who had boarded the plane using a stolen passport. It seems likely that he had boarded the plane with bad intentions. But what those intentions were, nobody knows. Some people believe that he was a terrorist who intended to crash the plane into a building in Beijing. Others believe that he was a hostage negotiator who intended to hijack the plane and negotiate for a ransom. Still, others believe that he was an assassin who intended to kill a specific target on the plane. The problem is there's no concrete evidence to support any of these theories, so we don't know what Paschal's true intentions were. As for the cabin crew, well, there's absolutely no evidence that any of them had anything to do with the crash, so we can safely rule them out. In the end, we may never know what truly happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, but one thing is for sure, the truth is out there somewhere. Hopefully, one day we'll uncover it. Now check out, what actually killed Elvis Presley, the definitive truth, or watch, what happened to Amelia Earhart, the definitive truth.